Less than 3 weeks ago, something changed within Russia. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former hot dog salesman turned multi-millionaire and head of the private military company Wagner Group, initiated an armed protest against the Russian government. Within a day, his rebellion was aborted, and by the standards of Russian history, ended relatively peacefully. Upon an agreement, he would be exiled to Belarus. Though its physical impact was negligible and could therefore be only considered a footnote in the Ukraine war when historians record events many years from now, the ripples it has made in Russian society are yet to dissipate. This is because the fact such an event even happened has highlighted a problem that Russia has had for the duration of its war in Ukraine, one that has thus far made victory a very elusive prospect. It is not the Russian military's equipment, it is not the quality of its troops, it is not its strategy, and it is not its morale, though this factor has influenced all of these to some extent over the last year. Something so petty, yet ultimately so crucial, which has decided the fate of nations for millennia. Politics. Welcome to the Watchman's broadcast, and today we are going to analyse how politics is the biggest weakness of Russia's combat operations in Ukraine. Also, before we start, this will be the last non-country balls video on this channel. If you want to see more, please check out my new channel, Warriors Tales, for more videos like this. With that said, let's get into it. Politics is something that is often overlooked as having an influence in warfare, namely as it is less interesting than strategy or a comparison of equipment. And yet famously, it was the political weakness of the Western powers that through their policy of appeasement ensured Hitler walked into Czechoslovakia almost unopposed in 1938 and 1939. Equally, it was the political mood of defeatism amongst France's decision makers which saw the Wehrmacht conquer Western Europe in 6 weeks, rather than the lack of courage of the French soldier, as is commonly believed. In turn, it was Hitler's decision to direct the Battle of Stalingrad through his own political ideology and squander his men's tactical superiority, which ensured the destruction of the Sixth Army. Ultimately, his failure to acknowledge this mistake also led Germany to defeat and ruination at the end of World War II. The world has not changed in the 21st century, and politics has been the greatest weakness of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We will not go into the details as to why the Kremlin decided to invade, but the term used for the invasion tells us everything: a special military operation. I do not believe the Kremlin employed this title ironically or as a veiled cover to justify its actions. There is evidence to suggest this is genuinely all they thought it would be. We now know the Kremlin estimated the conflict would last just under a week to over a month at most, concluding the bulk of the Ukrainian population would receive the Russian troops positively or passively. They chose to believe, with a rapid advance, most Ukrainians would refuse to offer serious resistance to defend the Ukrainian government, aside from those they deemed neo-Nazis of the volunteer units, like the Azov regiment. Such a preconceived notion was a complete fantasy, not only in hindsight, but something that had been proven to the Russians in 2014 and 2015 during their intervention in the Donbass War. Though volunteer units, like the Azov battalion, did fight hard, so did more conventional Ukrainian mechanized and air assault brigades. This was well known to Russian intelligence services like the GRU and FSB, who were also aware this had not changed in 2022. The chief of the FSB's International Intelligence Agency, Sergei Besida, and his deputy, Anatoly Bolyuk, both gave cautionary statements on the 21st of February 2022, 3 days before the invasion, when the Kremlin discussed the prospect of recognizing the independence of the separatist republics in Ukraine. Bolyuk stated only approximately 30 to 38% of Ukrainians would support becoming part of Russia, which was likely the best case scenario. The FSB most certainly advised the Kremlin leaders, both political and military, against acting on their false assumptions about Ukraine, something we can clearly see was ignored through this interaction with President Putin.
Мы и в нынешней ситуации просто обязаны поступить таким образом. Согласился бы с предложением Николая Платоновича о том, что нашим, так сказать, западным партнерам можно дать последний шанс с тем, чтобы предложить им в кратчайшие сроки заставить Киев пойти на мир и выполнить Минские соглашения. В противном случае мы должны принять то решение, о котором сегодня говорится.
Что значит, в противном случае вы предлагаете начать переговорный процесс?
Нет, я...
Или признавать суверенитет их?
А я
Говорите прямо.
Я поддержу предложение о признании...
Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей.
Поддерживаю предложение...
Так и скажите, да или нет.
Да. Поддерживаю предложение о вхождении Донецкой и Луганской народных республик в состав Российской Федерации.
Да, мы об этом не говорим, мы этого не обсуждаем. Мы говорим о признании их независимости или нет.
Да, я поддерживаю предложение о признании независимости.
Хорошо, пожалуйста, садитесь. Спасибо. Владимир Александрович.
These facts were disregarded. Russia's ruling class therefore decided to attribute all Ukrainian hostility towards them to be from units labelled neo-Nazis, which would be 10 to 20,000 men if supported by a few professional units. Therefore, they assigned 190,000 Russian troops to the invasion, rather than the 400,000 geopolitical analysts had said would be needed for such a task. They assumed this would be more akin to regime change, like the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, rather than a declaration of total war. The Russian military started its drill in November 2021 along Ukraine's border and received no orders to invade, likely because the Kremlin did not think it needed to. It probably believed a show of strength along the border would deter Ukraine from making further steps to integrate with the West, and in particular NATO, which the Kremlin deemed unacceptable. Only when it was clear Russia would achieve no concessions or deals from either Ukraine or the West did it decide to invade. The first clear signs of a potential invasion came on February the 18th, 2022, when the Luhansk People's Republic asked if it could evacuate civilians to Russia due to increased shelling from Ukraine, and Russia obliged, indicating it expected things to get worse and would send peacekeepers to assist. Prior to this, flare-ups between Ukraine and the separatists had occurred for years in the Donbass and were met with no response from the Russian government. It is also possible that Putin thought this sign of commitment to action may still yet yield political results, as it was arranged US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken would meet with Kremlin officials to discuss the crisis on Thursday, the 24th of February 2022. The Americans called off this meeting on February the 22nd, and ironically, the Russians invaded the day the meeting was set to take place. It is therefore possible it was only confirmed Russia would be taking military action in Ukraine 2 days before it did, and thus no battle plans were drawn up. We can see this in the conduct of the invasion, which is detailed in Owen Matthews' book, Overreach. It is noted how many thousands of Russian servicemen partaking in the exercise could not join the invasion as they were conscripts, and by law, conscripts could only serve within Russia's borders unless it was attacked. Therefore, some units on average only had 4 men per APC, rather than 7, and thus Russian columns lacked infantry support, as the soldiers were too few and did not want to risk leaving their BTRs due to their reduced numbers. Thus, armoured columns became easy prey for Ukrainian anti-tank teams, as the Russian infantry were too few to flush them out. Others left some of their equipment in the barracks, as they assumed they were just going on an exercise and would be back in a day or two. In turn, when commanders asked for their mobile phones before deploying, they did not hand them over, as they assumed it may be an effort to steal them, for again, it was just an exercise. The signals these phones gave off were geolocated and provided Ukraine with critical information on their enemy's movements. Russian units assumed no combat formations, simply driving in single file, with their only orders being to reach this town or city as fast as possible, as they had not known they were going to war until they were starting to cross the border. Even the Russian VDV paratroopers who conducted the helicopter assault on the Hostomel airport did not know they were doing it until 2 hours prior to landing, and even their officers had only found out that morning, despite this being a prime strategic objective for the whole northern arm of the invasion. This, alongside the failure of the Russian Air Force to follow up on its initial attacks against Ukrainian air bases, the weather, and several other factors, all point to the conclusion the Russian military clearly was not prepared for the possibility of a war. It was instead thrown into a conflict based on a lack of further political options by its leaders to achieve an end goal, rather than a thorough, thought-out strategic plan. To compare the special military operation with the US invasion of Iraq, the Russians actually deployed less ground troops than the Americans did for their invasion. But, like the Russians, the US coalition arrived in Saudi Arabia, just across the border from the country it would attack 3 months before the invasion, in this case, December 2002. But here is the difference from the mouths of these US servicemen.
And if we are called to go to Iraq, we will obviously, we'll do our jobs. We're soldiers. We'll go at that time.
Yeah, if it happens, we'll be ready. We've been training a lot, so I'm not really worried about it if it happens, but I couldn't tell you one way or the other if I think it's going to happen or not. I really don't know. Okay.
They were prepared for combat. They did not know they would be called to war, but were getting prepared should the need arise. Also, the US was planning for a war despite the fact its adversary was a third-rate military with inferior equipment. The US Marines were not informed of the day of the invasion to simply drive to Baghdad. And yet, this is largely what the Russians did, despite the fact their enemy was a 170,000 strong professional army with relatively modern equipment in a country whose government and people had been preparing for the prospect of a large war for 8 years. The results are plain to see. The US Air Force destroyed the Iraqi Air Force on the ground within 2 days, and Iraq was conquered in under a month, where the Russian Air Force is still yet to crush the Ukrainian Air Force, and the war has dragged on for over a year. Consequently, this bad political move ensured we will never know how well the professional Russian military would have fared if able to fight to its full potential with a peer nation. Due to the Kremlin's political blunder, no plans were drawn up to supply the invasion force, and when the invasion stalled, demands for everything from ammo to new tyres for trucks and even basics like in-date food were simply not arriving in the first weeks. It also revealed a genuine weakness of the Russian military in the fact its logistics were mediocre and in a crisis, poor. Regular Russian soldiers, many already confused about the situation, therefore quickly shied from engaging in bloody assaults, which left the elite soldiers like the Spetsnaz, VDV and naval infantry with the task of leading these assaults. From Kiev to Kharkiv and Mariupol, Russia's elite soldiers consequently bore the brunt of the casualties, and this is part of the reason this video was made. Many content creators have decried these troops as somehow being inadequate, despite the fact they were largely fighting the Ukrainian military unsupported in the first 2 months, and their actual performance under the circumstances was good. Indeed, if during the Battle of Normandy the only US units charging into the assault was the Rangers and the airborne divisions, the outcome would likely be similar. Russia's elite soldiers were squandered in most sectors, as they were called to pick up the slack left by the clumsy nature of the invasion, and while the gamble was successful in the south, it was a complete failure in the north. As a result, the Russians were forced to retreat in order to regroup their disorganized and overstretched forces. This compelled the Russians to do exactly what they had aimed to avoid and attack in an open, conventional offensive from the east, with their best units depleted from their earlier missteps. Using Chechens and separatist units to hastily fill the ranks, the Russians were able to make a creeping advance in the Donbass between April and June, due to its superior firepower and heavy weaponry, despite its losses. Regardless, it was clear the Russian military could not defeat Ukraine decisively with the resources it had, and the advance started to wane after the captures of Popasna, Severodonetsk and Mariupol. The belief the war would be measured in weeks meant all soldiers involved were only contracted to serve 6 months in Ukraine, and with the high casualties, men were short. The Russians therefore started to dig in to secure their gains, as it was running out of manpower for offensive operations, but even then was found to be overstretched. As the Ukrainians attacked towards Kherson at the end of August 2022, when the 6-month contract came to an end and many Russian soldiers were going home, Russia needed to pull men from across the entire front line to counter the Ukrainian offensive. This left the Donbass front line increasingly porous, and thus, a week later, when Ukraine attacked there as well, it found as little as 3,000 exhausted Russians opposing their vanguard of 8,000 men, resulting in a successful Ukrainian offensive that lasted a month. Indeed, if not for the arrival of Wagner mercenaries in numbers close to that of a division around Bakhmut, the Russians may not have been able to assemble enough men to eventually contain the Ukrainian advance in the northeast. Also, due to interdiction of Russian logistics, the Ukrainians would ultimately capture Kherson too in November. All this a result of poor political decisions when launching the invasion that continued to hamper the Russian efforts on the battlefield months later. This led to the judgment in parts of the world, especially the West, that Russia's abilities to wage war were poor in all regards, from equipment to morale and to strategic doctrine. This in turn has resulted in few actually identifying what strengths Russia possesses despite its callous entry into the Ukrainian war. Its mobilization has called up as many as 500,000 men in less than a year, addressing its manpower problem, an impressive feat by any standard. Despite many pointing to equipment shortages due to the appearance of old tanks like the T-62, rusty AK-47s, and Russia supplying its men with old Soviet helmets made up to fit the dimensions of modern camouflage covers, nothing could be further from the truth. While not modern equipment, aside from perhaps the United States, no Western country would be able to supply over 500,000 troops at such short notice, the way Russia has. Indeed, the British military only possesses 300,000 rifles in total, while new recruits into the German Bundeswehr have reported not receiving body armour or helmets during peacetime training due to stocks being depleted from those sent to Ukraine. In contrast, Russia's production of artillery shells has kept pace with the demands of the conflict, as has their quantity of cruise and ballistic missiles, when subsidised by cheaper suicide drones, despite being the most sanctioned country in history. Also, while old tanks are being called into service, over 800 are being modernised, and over 200 brand new T-90Ms have been produced since the start of the war, compared to EU tank production of just 18 vehicles in the same time frame. Russia's war industry in 2023 proved adequate to grind down the Ukrainians, who come the new year were increasingly asking for Western tanks, artillery and even aircraft, as their own numbers and ammunition stocks started to run dry. Despite pushing more men into Bakhmut, and after months of vicious fighting, the large town was finally taken by the Russians on May the 21st, 2023. Though losses were heavy on both sides, Russia was more likely to be able to replace its casualties than Ukraine, who had by this point called up 1 million of the 1.5 million men capable of being conscripted. The long-awaited Ukrainian spring offensive, which came in the summer due to the diversion of troops to Bakhmut and the wait for sufficient numbers of Western infantry fighting vehicles and tanks, has made no real impression on the Russian lines a month later. Western vehicles have been seen destroyed in their dozens, in part due to lack of air cover, as Ukrainian medium and long-range SAMs were increasingly being sent to defend Ukrainian cities and infrastructure due to their shortage of missiles. After a year, Russia finally seemed to have regained the initiative and organised into an effective fighting force. And then, despite all its gains, Russian stability took another crucial hit, despite no reversals at all on the front. On July the 1st, 2023, just 6 weeks after Wagner Group secured Bakhmut for the Russian ground forces, its men would be compelled to sign contracts with the Russian MOD. Yevgeny Prigozhin, despite being a member of Putin's inner circle, coming to the aid of the Russian military in its darkest hour, and ultimately prevailing at Bakhmut after losing 20,000 men dead in 8 months of grinding attritional warfare, was to be rewarded by having his PMC effectively terminated as an entity in Ukraine. Prigozhin had protested against the unimaginative tactics advocated by Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and the stagnant bureaucracy which denied his men sufficient artillery supplies to conduct their offensive assaults which won Bakhmut. While clearly losing influence and power, Prigozhin also advocated fighting the war more aggressively to bring about a decisive and less costly end, but saw he was being ignored and overruled by the Kremlin, just as the FSB had been when cautioning against a hasty invasion. Fearing the Russian military and its soldiers would be subject to perhaps years of warfare like that of Bakhmut, Prigozhin took matters into his own hands. On June the 23rd, 2023, he led Wagner to Rostov-on-Don inside Russia itself in what he called a march of justice, clearly aiming to remove what he saw as the subpar leadership of the Russian military. Not finding Shoigu in Rostov, over 5,000 men from Wagner started to drive on Moscow itself. Though Prigozhin would call off this action, in his words, to avoid further bloodshed, and President Putin would thank the Russian FSB, military and National Guard for their solidarity in defense of the constitution and the law, the mark this event has left in Russia could not be more profound. Wagner has become some of Russia's most professional, battle-hardened and respected soldiers due to their role in Ukraine. The fact such men decided to rebel against the military that employed them and defy their government speaks volumes. What speaks even greater volumes is the fact many ordinary Russians supported their decision. Wagner troops crossed from Ukraine to Rostov unopposed by Russian ground forces. Citizens came out onto the streets of Rostov to cheer them, and of the aircraft that did attack them, most were not aware it was Wagner they were attacking. The only unit that openly showed willingness to engage Wagner was Kadyrov's Chechens, non-Slavic Russians, and officially not part of the military, but the National Guard. This all reveals how divided Russia is on the decisions being made by its leaders on the conduct of the war. Not to mention, the fact Wagner shot down as many as 6 helicopters and a command and controlled aircraft in one day also demonstrates what Russian air defences can do even when on the move with proper planning, in contrast to the very sporadic air defence the invasion force had in February 2022. With this openly hostile discourse now surrounding the nature of the war, the Kremlin could have chosen to compromise and give voice to new strategies to pacify those disgruntled amongst the ranks of the military. Thus far, it appears to have done the opposite. Within a week of the Wagner revolt, rumours of Soviet-style crackdowns in the FSB and the belief Sergei Surovikin, often known as General Armageddon, was under house arrest for his suspected sympathies with Prigozhin. For this to happen to the only senior Russian general who has shown notable skill in Ukraine through organising defences to stop the bleeding of Russian forces after the Ukrainian offensives in late summer 2022, this demonstrates it is unlikely the Kremlin has learned from its mistakes that led to the Wagner revolt, let alone the policies that led to the Russian military's dismal performance the year before. Thus far, the Russian hierarchy have proven Prigozhin correct, and despite decisively stopping the Ukrainian summer offensive, they appear to be doing nothing to capitalise on Ukraine's current weakness. If this is the case, while the Russian line may be unlikely to break, it is unlikely to advance as well, beyond a localised gain here and there, thus turning the conflict in Ukraine into a protracted, grinding war which could last years and may risk more men deciding to follow Wagner's example should further mishaps occur due to selfish political mismanagement. Only time and history will tell if the Russian military will be able to once again recover from the thuggish political decisions which shackle it. The world will be watching, and so will the Russian people. Thank you all for watching. Please check out the Warriors Tales channel for more content like this. It includes an analysis of the Ukrainian Air Force and a profile on the Russian units fighting for Ukraine, similar to my Sparta Battalion video. Also, give this channel a like and subscribe if you are new here for more content, as it will otherwise sadly be very infrequent. But hopefully I will see you all again soon. Have a pleasant day.